not be taught in America's public schools because it is part of a religion. But evolution can be taught, even though it is also a part of another religion called humanism. Our Supreme Court does not want to separate church and state as long as the religion being taught in our schools is humanism. Something is wrong. But why should we concern ourselves with this little-known religion? Most of us have probably never heard of it. So why should we care what those people believe? Because humanism is becoming the official religion of America. Some of America's most visible and prominent citizens are humanists. Among the signers of the Humanist Manifesto were, number 96, Isaac Asimov, an American author, or at least an author rather, Andrei Sakharov, a Russian scientist, B.F. Skinner, a psychologist, and Betty Friedan, founder of the National Organization of Women. The humanists honor one of their own each year as the Humanist of the Year. Some who have been so honored are number 97, John Kenneth Galbraith, an economist and ex-ambassador to India, Helen Caldecott, a feminist, Carl Sagan, the astronomer we've quoted before, and Benjamin Spock, doctor and child care expert. But perhaps one of the most memorable humanists is Madalyn Murray O'Hair, the woman who removed all prayer from our public schools in a 1963 case before the Supreme Court. Mrs. O'Hair is also an avowed atheist. She was also the editor of the magazine called The Free Humanist and has been elected and re-elected to the board of the American Humanist Association. Mrs. O'Hair brought the lawsuit because she objected to a voluntary, notice voluntary prayer that opened the school day in her son's Baltimore school. William Murray, the son in his mother's lawsuit, has since broken from his mother and become a Christian. He has told us a little about his mother and her religious and political views. He said this, number 98, "My mother, Madalyn Murray O'Hair, was always a Marxist. She was the manager of an official Communist Party bookstore. She was chairman of the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, which was a communist front. In 1960, she applied for citizenship in the Soviet Union." This was the lady who removed prayer from our schools. Another well-known humanist, as I said a few minutes ago, is Isaac Asimov, a professor of biochemistry at the Boston University School of Medicine. He's written this, number 99, "I'm a humanist and proud of it. This means I place my confidence in the ultimate power of reason." He was, as I said, named the Humanist of the Year in 1984. The 1986 winner was Faye Waddleton, president of the Planned Parenthood Federation of America. She was honored for her, quote, "dedicated support for family planning and birth control," unquote. But there is a far more compelling reason to learn all about humanism. It is the official religion being taught in the public schools of America. I'd like to discuss how atheism, evolution, and humanism have been allowed to become the only religion taught in America's schools. One of the 34 people who signed the Humanist Manifesto, one, was John Dewey, the father of so-called progressive education. Let me show you just how important Mr. Dewey is in America's schools program. In 1974, Saturday Review, a nationwide publication, asked some of America's leading educators to name the most influential educator between the years 1924 and 74. Their answer was John Dewey. One of those educators interviewed went so far as to say, "No individual has influenced the thinking of American educators more. John Dewey, atheist, John Dewey, evolutionist, John Dewey, Marxist, has influenced American educators more than any other educator." John Dewey has also written this, number 2, "There is no God and there is no soul. Hence, there are no needs for the props of traditional religion. With dogma and creed excluded, then immutable truth is also dead and buried. There is no room for fixed natural law or permanent moral absolutes." Let's examine what America's leading educator just told us. Notice what he said, number 3, "There is no God." Dewey reasoned that man's mind could not prove the existence of God, so he concluded that there was no God. That thinking is completely erroneous. About 2 years ago, I wrote a 34-page pamphlet that proves, notice I'm using the word proves, that God does exist. I've entitled it, God Exists. There is no other option. I can prove, using science, reason, and logic, that man's mind can prove that God exists. Dewey was wrong. Not only was Dewey wrong about the existence of God, he was wrong about all sorts of things. Let me continue examining what Dewey believed in. He wrote this, number 4. Immutable truth is also dead and buried. The word immutable is defined by the dictionary as number 5, never changing, unchangeable. The word truth is defined as number 6, reality, conformity with fact. Dewey wrote that since religion was dead, number 7, unchangeable reality could be changed and could become dead and buried. How can that which is unchangeable be changed? How can that which is real be unreal? Dewey said that that which is unchangeable can change. Dewey said that that which is real is not real. Someone out of touch with reality is deemed to be insane. Dewey was out of touch with reality. Dewey thought that reality wasn't real. Dewey was insane. Dewey believed that that which was by definition unchangeable could change. Dewey was saying that a straight line could curve. If a straight line curves, it isn't straight, unless you think like John Dewey. And then you're recognized as the most influential educator in America. Dewey wrote this, number 8. There is no room for fixed natural law or permanent moral absolutes. Here Dewey says that that which is fixed isn't fixed. That which is permanent isn't permanent. That which is an absolute isn't absolute. This is simple madness. John Dewey agreed with Nikolai Lenin, the atheistic communist, who also believed in evolution. Lenin wrote this, number 9. We, of course, say that we do not believe in God. We do not believe in eternal morality. Communists must regard themselves as free, indeed morally obligated, to violate the truthfulness, respect for life, etc., when it is clear that more harm to communist objectives would be done by adhering to such principles than by violating them. That is moral, that serves the destruction of the old society. Lenin was an atheist, just like John Dewey. Lenin was a communist, just like John Dewey. Lenin was an evolutionist, just like John Dewey. Lenin wanted to destroy religion, just like John Dewey. Lenin wrote, number 10, we must combat religion. Down with religion. Long live atheism. The spread of atheism is our chief task. Communism abolishes eternal truths. It abolishes all religion and morality. Notice that Lenin said that communism could abolish eternal truths. How can you abolish that which is eternal? If it is eternal, it cannot be abolished unless you're not in touch with reality, unless you're insane. Lenin was just as insane as Dewey. Notice that both Dewey and Lenin wanted to destroy all morality. They both wanted to replace the traditional Judeo-Christian system of morality with a new system of morality called situation ethics. Dewey wrote this, number 11, there is no room for fixed natural law or permanent moral absolutes. The two men, Lenin and Dewey, were two thinkers on the same wavelength. They were both communists, atheists, evolutionists, and out to destroy religion. They were humanists. In 1949, Life magazine wrote an article about John Dewey. The caption reads, Life congratulates John Dewey. Mr. Dewey had turned 90, and Life was visiting his birthday party. They said that Dewey was number 12, the man whose thinking has influenced American education more than any other individual of his time. Life did say that Dewey was controversial and went so far as to say this, number 13. 20 years ago, he was labeled the leading red, meaning communist, in American education. Life magazine tells the truth. Another signer of the Humanist Manifesto was Joseph Fletcher, a visiting professor of the School of Medicine at the University of Virginia. The dust jacket of Professor Fletcher's book, entitled Situation Ethics, the New Morality, provides the reader with an accurate summary of his position. Number 14. The sensational deduction which the author draws for his premise includes the bold statement that any acts, even lying, premarital sex, abortion, adultery, and murder, could be right depending on the situation, because whatever is the most loving thing in a situation is the right and good thing. It is not excusably evil, it is positively good. Professor Fletcher has written this, number 15. For me, there are no rules at all. Anything and everything is right or wrong according to the situation. What is wrong in some cases would be right in others. And this candid approach is indeed a revolution in morality. It was indeed a revolution in morality. It was the exact opposite of the old morality. Situation ethics is really no morality. Each person decides what is right and wrong for themselves. Ernest Hemingway, one of America's best-known writers, summed up situation ethics thusly. Number 16. I know only what is moral is what you feel good after, and what is immoral is what you feel bad after. To show you just how foolish this so-called moral philosophy is, let's examine just what Hemingway said. Let's presume that someone who agreed with Hemingway approached him with a gun and said, Mr. Hemingway, I will feel good, therefore moral, after I shoot you. Hemingway, if he truly believed in what he said, would have to say to this person with the gun, go ahead and fire, and then enjoy. That's just how stupid this philosophy is. Hemingway would no more agree to that than John Dewey or Nikolai Lenin would. Others believe that this philosophy is correct as well. Albert Pike, the Sovereign Grand Commander of the Scottish Rite of Freemasonry, said this on page 37 of his book entitled Morals and Dogma, number 17. All truths are truths of period and not truths for eternity. In other words, there are no absolutes. Eternal truths aren't eternal. Man can change that which is eternal. The Masons believe in situation ethics. W.L. Wilmhurst, a writer on the subject of Masonry, says this in his book entitled The Meaning of Masonry, number 18. What is good for me may be evil for you. What is right to do at one moment may be wrong the next. A few years ago, a National Diet Cola company started a television advertising campaign that promoted this new morality. The first one that I saw of the two had two well-known football players talking about the soft drink, and an off-picture announcer says this, you make a choice because it feels right. The second ad featured Geraldine Ferraro, the 1984 Democratic Party vice presidential candidate. During this commercial, an off-picture announcer says, in making a choice, what's right is what feels right. That is called situation ethics. According to that statement, Adolf Hitler was right when he planned World War II that would ultimately murder 50 million people. All Hitler had to do was say that he was making this choice because it felt right. This so-called ethical system has caused harm to millions of people, yet there are still those who believe in it. The Humanist Manifesto number 2 said this in 1973, number 19. We affirm that moral values derive their source from human experience. Ethics is situational. Yet humanism and situation ethics are parts of the religion being taught in America's schools. Mel and Norma Gabler are a Texas couple who became concerned about what their children were being taught in their public schools. They started reading textbooks and discovered that they were full of humanism. They were quoted as saying this, number 20. After reviewing hundreds of books, line by line, there is no question in our mind that textbooks are permeated with humanism. We are constantly accused of trying to inflict our own beliefs upon the majority, when actually it is the other way around. A minority has been doing this to our children for years. But this was to be expected. The humanists wanted to teach their religion, and their religion only, in our public schools. Charles Francis Potter, a humanist who signed the Humanist Manifesto #1, wrote this, number 21. Education is thus a most powerful ally of humanism, and every American public school is a school of humanism. The Humanist Manifesto for January-February 1983 told us dumb taxpayers that the religion would be taught in our tax-supported schools whether we liked it or not. The article was entitled, "A Religion for a New Age," and said this, number 22. The battle for humankind's future must be waged and won in the public school classroom by teachers who correctly perceive their roles as the proselytizers of a new faith, a new faith. The classroom must and will become an arena of conflict between the old and the new, the rotting corpse of Christianity and the new faith of humanism. Robert G. Ingersoll wrote this on page 189 of his book entitled The Humanist in 1959, number 23. All the disciples of superstition, apparently I presume that means those who believe in God, feel that schools where no religion is taught are their enemies. They are right. Keep the Bible out of the school. Prevent the teaching of any creed, except, of course, the creed known as humanism, and the next generation will be free thinkers. John J. Dunphy, another writer in the Humanist magazine, wrote this, number 24. The teachers of humanism must embody the same selfless dedication as the most rabid fundamentalist preachers, for they will be ministers of another sort, utilizing a classroom instead of a pulpit to convey humanistic values in whatever subject they teach, regardless of the educational level, preschool, daycare, or a large state university. We taxpayers will pay for the religion of humanism being taught in our schools. Why are the humanists concerned about teaching children their religion in our public schools? Someone answered that question in 1973. He is a professor of education at Harvard University, and this is what he said, number 25. Every child in America entering school at the age of 5 is mentally ill because he comes to school with certain allegiances towards our founding fathers, towards our elected officials, toward his parents, towards a supernatural being, toward the sovereignty of this nation as a separate entity. The United Nations repeated this thought, that your children are sick. They wrote this, number 26. All children will be found to have some prejudices caused by the home. It is important for teachers to recognize that these prejudices exist and that they must be corrected and good attitudes developed. The national training laboratories run by the National Education Association, the NEA, the Teachers Union, talked about children who are mentally well, number 27. Although they appear to behave appropriately and seem normal by most cultural standards, they may actually be in need of mental health care in order to help them change, adapt, and conform to the planned society in which there will be no conflict of attitudes or belief. We must all believe the same thing, humanism. The National Education Association actually told us how they will deal with those children that they have been taught values by their parents. They wrote in a report entitled Education for the 1970s, number 28. Schools will become clinics. Schools will become clinics whose purpose is to provide individualized psycho-social treatment for the student, and teachers must become psycho-social therapists. This will include biochemical and psychological mediation of learning as drugs are introduced experimentally to improve in the learner such qualities as personality, concentration, and memory. Children are to become the objects of experimentation. The National Education Association said that about your children. For those of you who might believe that your child can be taught your religious values in your church or synagogue on a once-a-week basis, let me tell you that the humanists know that you cannot succeed. Charles Francis Potter, the humanist we quoted a few minutes ago, anticipated that problem and showed his contempt for those who voiced that concern with this statement, number 29. What can the theistic Sunday schools, meeting for an hour once a week and teaching only a fraction of the children, do to stem the tide of a 5-day program of humanistic teaching? Parents, figure it out. You've lost your children to the humanists. Their values are now the values of your children, and you are paying for these bizarre teachings through your taxes. Our schools have become churches. The Jewish religion teaches its religion in synagogues. The Christian religion teaches its religion in churches. And the humanist religion teaches its religion in schools to your children. But the humanists, the socialists, and the communists have been telling us for years that they want our children. The Communist Party told us in 1919 that our children belong to them. They wrote this, number 30. Give us one generation of small children to train to manhood and womanhood, and we will set up the Bolshevist form of the Soviet government. The communists were being consistent when they kidnapped thousands of Afghan children for indoctrination in Russia in 1984. In 1933, Adolf Hitler, the German socialist, wrote this, number 31. When an opponent declares, I will not come over to your side, I calmly say, your child belongs to us already. What are you? You will pass on. Your descendants, however, now stand in the new camp. In a short time, they will know nothing else but this new community called socialism, Nazism, or communism. But Hitler was only being consistent with the command issued by Adam Weishaupt, the father of secret societies, the founder of the Illuminati. We've covered him for many times in the past weeks. He wrote this, number 32. It is necessary to gain the common people to our order. The best means to that end is influence in the schools. But why have the humanists been allowed to get away with it? We have been told that the Bible believers and those who believe in the creationist theory of origins cannot have these views taught in the public schools of America because the Constitution requires the separation of church and state. I'd like to examine this premise to prove that it is totally in error. The phrase, number 33, separation of church and state, does not appear in the Constitution. It was used by Thomas Jefferson, the author of the Declaration of Independence, in a letter in 1802. He used the phrase, number 34, wall of separation between church and state. To understand what he meant by that phrase, we've got to examine President Jefferson and the American Revolution. America's founding fathers were in the main religious men. They believed that religion was an extremely important part of the American experience, but they feared a national government that would establish a national religion. They felt that the federal government should be absolutely excluded from any authority in the field by establishing a particular religion as the national religion. They acted accordingly when they wrote the following as part of the First Amendment to the United States Constitution, number 35. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. They did not, notice, they did not restrict the right of the individual state to establish a state religion. In fact, at least 7 of the original 13 states had officially established religions or denominations at the time the Constitution was adopted. Jefferson wrote this in 1798, number 36. It is true that no power over the freedom of religion is delegated to the United States by the Constitution. All lawful powers respecting the same of right remain and were reserved to the states or to the people. When he was serving in the Virginia legislature, he introduced a bill to have a day of fasting and prayer. But when he became president, Jefferson said there was no authority in the federal government to proclaim religious holidays. In a letter to the Danbury Baptist Association dated January the 1st, 1802, he explained his position and said the Constitution had created, number 37, a wall of separation between church and state. He was saying that the federal government had no authority to establish a national religion. He was being completely consistent with what our other founding fathers had written when they wrote the First Amendment. How does all of this relate to what we've been discussing about the teaching of humanism in our public schools? Why is the government in the education business? Why should they concern themselves with what is being or is not being taught in our schools? If you read the American Constitution, you will find absolutely no authority for the federal government to be involved with education in any way. How did the government get into the education process in the first place? To answer that question, we must examine the history of education in America since its beginning in the 1600s. The first education in America was done in the homes of the parents. This was because basic religions require the parents to teach their own children. When we set down the Harvard University, the founder of Harvard University, as a good example, set down the rules and precepts that are to be observed in the college, Harvard University, as follows. This is a good example of how our founding fathers saw religion in schools. Harvard University said, the founder said, number 38, let every student be plainly instructed and earnestly pressed to consider well the main ends of life and studies, to know God and Jesus Christ, which is eternal life, and therefore to lay Christ in the bottom as the only foundation of all knowledge and learning, and see the Lord only giveth wisdom. But there were others who didn't want our schools to teach Christian morality. They wanted the children themselves, and they wanted them in public schools. But they had a problem. The parents were not about to give them up to the state. They had to deceive the parents so that they would give their children away to the state so that the humanists could teach them. The lie that they used to trick the parents was that public education was free. Parents, give up your children to the states. It won't cost you anything. The real history of public education starts in 1816 when Robert Owen started a special school for the children of the mill workers as a socialist experiment at New Lanark, Scotland. Mr. Owen has been described as the father of modern socialism. New Lanark was Mr. Owen's attempt to prove the superiority of socialism to the free enterprise system. But it failed. Even Mr. Owen could not make socialism work. Socialism, as we've taught before, will not work, even when it is tried voluntarily. So Mr. Owen brought his failure to America to try again. He went to Indiana, where he started New Harmony in 1825. He said it was to be number 39, the focus of enlightened atheism. Once again, he started a school to teach the children about the alleged merits of socialism. Mr. Owen believed that number 40, a man's character is made for him by society through upbringing, education, and environment, and not by himself as the religion is taught. He believed that way because he believed that, number 41, man's character had been deformed by religious brainwashing. About a year later, New Harmony failed. Once again, socialism proved that it will not work. Once again, it proved that it won't work even when it was tried voluntarily. And Owen tried to figure out why it failed. Apparently, it never occurred to Mr. Owen that the reason New Harmony failed was because socialism was a failure. He decided that the people weren't ready for socialism because they hadn't been taught that it was superior. Education was the answer. Educate young people to accept socialism and to reject the free enterprise system. But never, never, never admit that socialism is a failure and that it won't work, even voluntarily. Owen and his followers decided that the only ones who wouldn't be able to see through the foolishness of the socialist system were the children. Teach them socialism and teach it as a success, and the children will buy it. Education of young people had to precede the creation of a socialist society. The young people would build it when they became adults. From that moment on, the Owenites would promote national public education as the preliminary step to socialism. But the Owenites had to get the children away from the parents as soon as possible, because in the first 5 years of their lives, the children could be set on their course by their parents. The Owenites suggested that children should be removed from their children at the age of 2 and be placed in district boarding houses. The National Education Association, the nationwide teachers union, set up a trial balloon in 1969 in a report called Forecast for the 70s, when they reported this, number 42. As non-school, preschool programs begin to operate, educators will assume a formal responsibility for children when they reach the age of 2. About 2 years later, President Richard Nixon said, number 43, "We have declared the first 5 years of a child's life to be a period of special and specific federal concern." The federal government, according to Richard Nixon, wants your children. This article was printed in April 17th, 1982, and tells the reader that, number 44, children can learn to read before they can talk or walk. A class for infants 4 to 6 months old was held at the Educational Resource Service Center. The day is coming. Secrets of History is a 27-week lecture series which has been exploring the conspiratorial view of history. I have studied this view that holds that the major events of the past have been caused intentionally. About 2 years ago, I published my book entitled The Unseen Hand. I've subtitled it An Introduction to the Conspiratorial View of History, and here it is. Tonight's session is number 27 and the last one of this series. For the past few weeks, we've been discussing America's new religion called humanism and how it is being taught in our public schools today. Last week, I started a discussion of how America got a nationwide system of public education, and I identified Robert Owen, the father of modern socialism, as also being the father of our public school system. Owens had tried twice to establish a socialist economy, once in Scotland and once in America. Both times he failed. Socialism will not work, even voluntarily, and Owens proved it twice. He came to realize that the only way he could socialize America was to teach the children. He wanted to create a public school system so that he could teach socialism. He had to get the children of America as soon as he could, before the parents set them on their course. The best he could hope to do was to start them at the age of 5 or 6. But the day is coming when the Owenites will get your children from birth to teach them socialism, and the pressure to achieve that goal is building. Compulsory kindergarten attendance and state-mandated preschool programs are being considered in nearly every state, and in 3 states, attendance is already compulsory. In 1825, a supporter of state education admitted that the Owenites realized why they supported socialized education. He said this, number 45, "Education is a powerful engine to sway the public sentiment, the public morals, and the public religion, more powerful than any other in the possession of government." The Owenites had other goals than to just teach your children socialism. They wanted to destroy Christianity. One Owenite said this in 1829, number 46, "The great object was to get rid of Christianity and to convert our churches into halls of science. The plan was to establish national schools from which all religion was to be excluded, in which nothing was to be taught but such knowledge as is verifiable by the senses, and to which all parents were to be compelled by law to send their children. But we Americans love our freedom too much to allow the Owenites to force us to give our children to the state, don't we? We'd never accept mandatory school attendance, would we? But we did, because we've been conned. In 1829, the socialist Owenites went underground and organized their activities nationwide in the form of a secret society in order to attain their goal of universal public education. Just 8 years later, the state of Massachusetts created the Board of Education and appointed Horace Mann as its general secretary. The move to create a national public education system had begun. Mr. Mann has been called the father of public education. He is on record as saying this, number 47, "What the church has been for medieval man, the public school must become for democratic and rational man. God would be replaced by the concept of the public good." Mann held this position until 1848 and worked to promote public education by holding teachers' conventions, delivering numerous lectures, introducing numerous reforms, and planning and inaugurating the Massachusetts public school system. The practical result of his work was the revolutionizing of the school system of Massachusetts and indirectly of the school system of other states. Mr. Mann promised the American people great things if we would give our children to the state so that they could be educated. He wrote this in 1841, number 48. The common, meaning the public school, is the institution which can receive and train up children in the elements of all good knowledge and of virtue before they are subjected to the alienating competitions of life. The institution is the greatest discovery ever made by man. Let the common school be expanded to its capabilities, and 9/10 of the crimes in the penal code would be obsolete. The long catalog of human ills would be abridged. Men would walk more safely by day. Every pillow would be more inviolable by night. Property, life, and character held by stronger tenure. All rational hopes respecting the future brightened. We've had 150 years of public education. Have the public schools delivered as we were promised? In 1983, the U.S. National Commission on Excellence in Education wrote this, number 49. Our nation is at risk. The educational foundations of our society are presently being eroded by a rising tide of mediocrity that threatens our very future as a nation and a people. Dr. John Goddard, formerly dean of the UCLA Graduate School of Education, said this, number 50. American schools are in trouble. In fact, the problems of schooling are of such crippling proportions that many schools may not survive. It is possible that our entire public education system is nearing collapse. Let's look at the product of our schools, the students. Some 23 million American adults are functionally illiterate by the simplest tests of everyday reading, writing, and comprehension. About 13% of all 17-year-olds in the United States can be considered functionally illiterate. The Department of the Navy reported that 25% of its recruits cannot read at the 9th grade level. It wasn't always that way. In America's earliest history, Americans could read. In 1765, future President John Adams wrote this, number 51. A native of America who cannot read or write is as rare an appearance as a comet or an earthquake. They didn't have dyslexia. Let me give you some more evidence that our schools have let us down. On a test of geography administered to 12-year-olds in Dallas, Texas, more than 20% could not even find the United States on a map. Another 20% identified Brazil as the United States. 17 and 18-year-old students were administered a test in 1984. These were some of their answers. Mexico and Canada were the last two states admitted to the United States. The Sinai Desert is in Vietnam, and Angola is in the Philippines. Now that, once again, was not always the case. These were questions on an 1875 U.S. high school entrance examination. This is to get you into high school, number 52. Name the countries of Europe, Asia, and Africa that touch upon the Mediterranean Sea. Name the states of the Union bordering on the Atlantic, on the Gulf of Mexico, on the Pacific, and on the Great Lakes. But how about man's promise that the public schools would reduce crime all over the United States? I'd like to talk a little bit about crime in our schools. These acts are created by those in school, the students, those who are directly under the control of our public school teachers. In 1978, the National Institute of Education released a study entitled Violent Schools, Safe Schools. It showed us that our public schools are anything but safe. Each month, 3 million high school students are victims of crimes in school. Each month, 282,000 students are assaulted. Each month, there are 2,400 acts of arson in schools. Each month, 125,000 teachers are threatened with physical violence. Each month, 1,000 teachers a month are assaulted badly enough to require medical care. Some saw the dangers of a public education system. In March of 1840, a bill was introduced to abolish the Board of Education. One who was in favor of that bill voiced his support this way, number 53. The idea of the state controlling education seems a dangerous precedent that is greatly to be feared that any attempt to force all of our schools and all of our teachers upon one model would destroy all competition, all emulation, and even the spirit of improvement itself. The bill was defeated, and the drive to create a national public education system continued, and they were successful. The Owenites have taken over our public schools. Number 54. The aim of education is no longer to impart facts and knowledge. The aim of education is to change the social values of the child away from those values that have been traditionally considered fundamental, fixed, permanent, or absolute. And the major force behind that drive in the recent past was John Dewey, the father of so-called progressive education. He once wrote that the schools were going to take, number 55, an active part in determining the social order of the future as the teachers align themselves with the forces making for social control of economic forces. That's called fascism. Where did Dr. Dewey get that idea from? He got it from Karl Marx. This little booklet is entitled Dewey on Education. It was written by and published by the Teachers College at Columbia University, where John Dewey once taught. This is a pro-John Dewey book. It was published by the school where Dewey used to teach. On page 6 of this book, it says this, 56. John Dewey was influenced by Karl Marx. Let me repeat that. Dewey was influenced by Karl Marx. John Dewey, humanist, evolutionist, atheist, communist, was influenced by Karl Marx, the so-called father of communism. The book continues and identifies two others who influenced Dr. Dewey, Lincoln Steffens and Upton Sinclair. I think it will be helpful for us to examine what these two men believed in to understand how they might have influenced John Dewey. Lincoln Steffens was a reporter and writer who became a socialist. In 1919, after the Communist Revolution in Russia, Mr. Steffens visited that nation and interviewed the communist murderer Nikolai Lenin. Don't forget that Lenin was starving and murdering millions of Russian citizens. By the time he was through, Lenin would have murdered as many as 40 million people. Steffens returned to America and reported, number 57, I have seen the future, and it works. Later, Mr. Steffens wrote, number 58, I have been 3 times to Soviet Russia since the revolution, and I am so sure that they have found a way that I use that observation in our American politics. I say that communism fits us like an old hat. He also praised Nikolai Lenin, again with this quote, number 59. To me, Lenin is not only the greatest revolutionary, he is also the greatest liberal. Lenin, the man who killed 40 million people, was great. The man who said that had dramatic influence on the most influential American educator in our history. The other individual who had great influence on John Dewey was Upton Sinclair. Mr. Sinclair was also a member of the Socialist Party and ran for office on that party label. He denied that he was a communist, but joined numerous Communist Front organizations. So the people who had the most influence on John Dewey, America's most influential educator, were socialists and communists. And our schools have become schools of propaganda for evolution, atheism, communism, and socialism. And those parents who object to these things being taught to their children run into all sorts of problems when they teach their own children or place them in private schools. And here's why. Michael Bakunin, the Russian anarchist, also wanted an exclusive monopoly for state education. He wrote this, number 60. So long as there exist 2 or several degrees of education, there inevitably will be classes of society in existence. James B. Conant, ex-president of Harvard University, said this, number 61. I do believe there is some reason to fear lest a dual system, meaning public and private education, of secondary education, may come to threaten the democratic unity provided by our public schools. Our schools should serve all creeds. Now notice what this learned man just told us. He said our schools should serve all faiths. That is impossible as long as people like Madalyn Murray O'Hair, the noted atheist, has been removing faith from our schools. She is saying that one person with a belief must yield to one person with no belief. This result was predicted in 1887 by A. A. Hodge, a Christian minister who wrote this, number 62. If every party in the state has the right of excluding from the public schools whatever he does not believe to be true, then he that believes most must give way to him that believes least, and then he that believes least must give way to him that believes absolutely nothing. This scheme, if it is consistently and persistently carried out, will make the United States system of national popular education the most efficient and wide instrument for the propagation of atheism which the world has ever seen. If you remove your children and place them in a private school because you don't want them taught these lies, you then have to pay for two educations, the private one as well as the public one. Government will not allow you to deduct your private school costs from your taxes. You must pay for two educations. The state of New Jersey felt that charging the parents for a public education when they are paying for a private one wasn't fair. They passed a law that gave state taxpayers a $1,000 tax deduction for each child in a non-public elementary or secondary school. The Supreme Court ruled by a vote of 6-3 that states may not give tax breaks to these parents. You will not put your children in a private school. Your children do not belong to you. Let me give you a few examples. 3 brothers and their wives removed their 16 children from public schools to teach them at home in accordance with their religious convictions. This was not acceptable to the state. 2 of the families finally submitted to the mandates of the state by returning their children to a public school. The 3rd family refused, and this is what happened. This is one of their children being taken by the authorities. She was placed in a state-run facility. That's the mother to the left rear. The state is taking her child. A father of a child has his child taken away from him, and he is fined. What was his crime? He refused to send his child by bus to a distant school in a high-crime area. Rebecca Higgins was an 11-year-old 6th grader who chose to do an oral book report on the Bible in a public school. She claims that her fellow classmates applauded her report and asked for free copies of the New Testament. The school district confiscated those Bibles, and she was told that giving out Bibles was illegal under Supreme Court rulings. Her attorneys are claiming that the school officials were violating her constitutional rights of free speech, as well as the school district's own policy that it is, number 63, firmly committed to a position of neutrality concerning religious expression. A mother of 2 takes her children out of public schools and teaches them at home. She claims that public schools are teaching things that conflict with her religious values. She is fined $100 and ordered to put them back in a public school. But the greatest rebels to the system are the public school teachers themselves. They know something is wrong, and they have been putting their children into private schools. In 1986, the Department of Education did a study that revealed that teachers in the government schools send their own children to private schools at a much higher rate than does the general population. For instance, in Albuquerque, New Mexico, 30% of public school teachers send their children to private schools, compared with 14% of the population at large. In San Francisco, the ratio is 28% to 19%. In Baltimore, it is 27% to 16%. In Los Angeles, it is 29% to 17%. And Atlanta, it is 25 and 14. The cities with the highest private school enrollment of public teachers' children were New Orleans at 50%, Washington, D.C. at 40%, Memphis and Detroit, Michigan at 35%. That's 40% Nashville and 35% in Detroit. The public school teachers know something is wrong, and they're doing something about it. They're taking their children out of the system. But they continue to teach your children. In other words, they don't want your children taught. They don't want their children taught the garbage they're teaching your children. Do these parents have the right to teach their own children? I'd like to discuss a landmark case that was heard in 1925 by the United States Supreme Court. They overturned an Oregon state law that established a public education monopoly and prohibited private and religious schools. The High Court held that the law unreasonably interferes with the liberty of parents and guardians to direct the upbringing and education of children under their control. The fundamental theory of liberty upon which all governments in this union repose excludes any general power to standardize its children by forcing them to accept instructions from public teachers only. The child is not the mere creature of the state. Those who nurture him and direct his destiny have the right, coupled with the high duty to recognize and prepare him for additional obligations. I'd like to cite a more recent case that ruled on a similar situation. In its important Wisconsin versus Yoder case in 1972, the Supreme Court reaffirmed the earlier 1925 ruling and overturned a state compulsory education statute. The Supreme Court said, 64, this case involves the fundamental interest of parents as contrasted with that of the state to guide the religious future and education of their children. This primary role of the parents in the upbringing of their children is now established beyond debate as an enduring American tradition. But if the Supreme Court ruled this way in 1925 and 1972, why do today's judges and authorities imprison and punish parents who wish to teach their own children? Maybe German White, an official of the U.S. Office of Child Development, answered the question when he said this, number 65. Parents don't mean to be incompetent, but they are. And the remedy is federal establishment of acceptable standards of child raising. But the real expert in education's real purpose has to be Nikolai Lenin, the communist dictator of Russia, who told us this, number 66. Only by radically remolding the teaching, organization, and training of the youth shall we be able to ensure that the efforts of the younger generation will result in the creation of a society that will be unlike the old society. In other words, in the creation of a communist society. The humanists are gaining control of our schools. And the last thing I'd like to discuss about education is what an appeal court said in 1976. The parents of a high school graduate discovered that the student could barely read and write. His parents sued the San Francisco Unified School District and sought damages for remedial education and for the wages their son would be unable to earn. They obviously felt that the school district had required that their son attend school under the mandatory attendance laws of that district. They must have felt that the district took their son for some reason. They probably presumed that that reason was that they were going to educate him. So when their son wasn't educated, they wondered why he had wasted 12 years of his life. So they sued. It's called false advertising when you say you're going to do something and then don't do it. It's called malpractice when you don't perform as you promised. The appeals court did not agree. The judge explained, number 67, the science of pedagogy, meaning the science of teaching itself, is fraught with different and conflicting theories. He went on to say this, number 68, there is no way to assess the school's negligence. Notice what he said. We don't know what education is. Therefore, when we don't educate anyone, it was because we didn't know what we were doing. Therefore, you can't sue us when we did what we knew we couldn't know how to do, educate people. You understand? They don't know, but they've got your children anyway. What are some problems? What are some solutions to this problem? I'd like to suggest three, number 69. Remove all obstacles to the use of non-governmental education, such as compulsory attendance laws and teacher certification requirements for home schools and private schools. Remove unfair tax burdens. Parents who do not use the state school system should not be taxed to support it. And number three, remove all federal involvement in education because there is not the slightest constitutional authority for this involvement, not one. I'd like to end this section with a real victory story. Someone has risen above the public school system and accomplished real successes. This is Marva Collins, one of America's truly great heroes. She was a 14-year veteran of Chicago's public school system who finally decided she couldn't tolerate it anymore. She is quoted as saying, number 70, "The longer I taught in the public school system, the more I came to think that schools were concerned with everything but teaching. Teaching was the last priority, something you were supposed to do after you collected the milk money or put up bulletin boards." She decided to open up her own school, and she took $5,000 from her pension fund and founded the West Side Preparatory School. She has run her school for 13 years and has not taken $1 of government funds. And she proudly tells us why, number 71. It's government that has gotten education into the mess it is today. She said she saw the eyes of the children in her neighborhood, number 72. They come home at the end of the day with listless expressions and dull eyes. The same children come here with their eyes lit up. She says that the most depressing part of this whole venture is that she has been besieged by calls from parents. She says that they will call up weeping, crying, saying, "Please accept my child." But she is limited to the number of children she can accept. Even so, her school has grown from the 4 in 1975 to 200 in 5 years. What does she do with these children? She bases her teaching on teaching the children reading skills. She recognizes that those who can't read can't do anything else. Her students are required to read one book every 2 weeks, memorize one poem a week, and write a composition each day on a topic she chooses. She says that her system works. She says that after just 3 days in her school, the children can read. And tests applied to her children show that they can indeed read. She has turned out 8th graders who can score at the 10th or 11th grade level. She has them reading Aristotle and Shakespeare. She says that this is her secret, number 73. We have helped give them a vision of what they can accomplish. Teaching works. Students will learn if properly taught. Why then can our public schools do what Mrs. Collins has done? Why are high school students illiterate? Maybe we can reform our public schools. Maybe we can correct the abuses. I don't believe we can, and here's part of the reason. Dr. Dwight Lee, professor of economics at the University of Georgia, spoke the truth when he said this, number 74. The underlying problem with public education is that it is public. As long as education remains a service provided and controlled by government, all reform efforts are doomed to fail. Maybe Dr. Medford Evans said it best when he wrote this, number 75. Government schools make it a matter of policy to spend as much money as possible and impart as little knowledge as possible, since spending demonstrates power while keeping the scholars ignorant, monopolizes power in the hands of the government insiders. Someone wants your children to be ignorant. Someone wants your children not to be able to read. And those are the people who are controlling our public schools today. It is time to abolish public education. It has not worked. For the past 26 weeks, I've been discussing the evidences that a giant conspiracy has been causing wars, depressions, revolutions, and inflations. The goal of this conspiracy has been a world government or communist government. Will they be successful? On November the 16th, 1956, Nikita Khrushchev, the Russian dictator, told the world, number 1, our firm conviction is that sooner or later capitalism will give way to socialism. Whether you like it or not, history is on our side. We will bury you. About 6 years later, on June the 19th, 1962, Khrushchev identified the we, that we're going to bury America. He said this, number 2, the United States will eventually fly the communist red flag. The American people will, notice this, the American people will hoist it themselves. So Khrushchev told us that we Americans are going to hoist the red flag of communism ourselves. Is this true? Will this conspiracy get us to allow them to communize America? I'd like to try to answer that question in the next few minutes. I want to admit that for the past 28 weeks, I've presented a rather depressing view of America's past. And I also want you to know that I do believe there is real hope for the future. But I must add a cautious word to that optimism. There is hope only if we act to prevent the plans of this conspiracy. The major reason there is some hope for the future is because informed Americans have gained some real victories over this conspiracy in the recent past. And I would dare say that the majority of Americans did not know that these victories were part of a war being waged in America. I'd like to discuss 3 of these victories in the next few minutes, but I'd like to say that these few victories are but a small percentage of those I could discuss, and I cover those in my book, The Unseen Hand. The first victory I'd like to discuss is the victory over an attempt by this conspiracy to create a separate nation inside the United States and then have that new nation protected by the League of Nations. I also believe that those plans were not designed to succeed, but were intended to create a situation that would force the American people to accept a dictatorship. The principle is to create a crisis, then impose a dictatorship as a solution to the problem that they know that is the only way that the American people will accept a dictatorship. That plan was to create a separate nation inside the United States by creating what they called, this conspiracy called, a Negro Soviet Republic in the southern states. This is a little booklet here entitled American Negro Problems. There it is. I've got it inside my cover. It was written by John Pepper, but it was publicized in 1928 by the Communist Party of America. Let me tell you what this little pamphlet's all about. On page 10 of this booklet, the Communist Party promised us, number 3, the Negroes. It promised the Negroes with a struggle for their right of national self-determination. Self-determination means the right to establish their own state, to erect their own government if they choose to do so. On page 12 it said, number 4, the Negro communists should emphasize in their propaganda the establishment of a Negro Soviet Republic. Now this is the second little book. Once again, I put it in the cover myself. It's called simply The Negroes in a, let me cover it, hold it this way, The Negroes in a Soviet America. This was written 7 years later in 1935. And as I said, it's entitled The Negroes in a Soviet America. It also was written by the Communist Party of America. This booklet told us where the Soviet Republic was going to be established. It was to be in approximately this area. Number 5, this is the Communist Party telling us where this Negro Soviet Republic will be established. It would be certain to include such cities as Richmond and Norfolk, Virginia, Columbia and Charleston, South Carolina, Augusta, Savannah, Atlanta and Macon, Georgia, Montgomery, Alabama, New Orleans and Shreveport, Louisiana, Little Rock, Arkansas, and Memphis, Tennessee. In other words, the South. One of the reasons the American Communist Party was unable to pull it off was because of the courage and determination of this American hero, Mr. Manning Johnson. He was a member of the Communist Party of the United States who had risen through the ranks to a position on the National Committee, the highest governing body of the Communist Party in America. After 10 years in the party, he broke from it and wrote this book here, entitled Color, Communism, and Common Sense by Manning Johnson. In it, he discusses the attempt to establish the Negro Republic and asks this question, number 6. What if 1 or 5 million Negroes die in an abortive attempt to establish a Negro Republic? Mr. Johnson wrote his book to warn his fellow Americans, and the bloody revolt he saw coming never happened. A truly great American patriot. One of the major goals of this conspiracy is to confiscate all privately owned weapons in America. It is interesting that within minutes of the deaths of the assassination of John Kennedy, Bobby Kennedy, and Martin Luther King, the cry went up to confiscate all weapons in the United States. Those who object to any gun confiscation scheme generally cite their constitutional right to keep and bear arms. They quote the Second Amendment as the source of that right. Number 7, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. One of the reasons America's founding fathers wrote that into the Constitution was because they knew that an armed population could never be conquered by a totalitarian government. Tyrannies cannot subjugate a population armed to resist. During the Hungarian and Polish revolutions of the 50s and 60s, the people had no way to resist, and the Russian tanks and troops remained and crushed the rebellion. If the people had had the means to resist, the Russian government would have removed their troops and tanks. One of the reasons Americans still have the constitutional right to keep and bear arms is a nationwide organization called the National Rifle Association. There was an attempt to remove them, or to move them rather, away from that single goal and into other lobbying activities such as ecology. Our newspaper of May the 23rd, 1977, carried this article in it that discussed that attempted change. The headline reads, "NRA deputy ousted in dogma coup." Those who believed that the NRA was being moved from its primary purpose removed the then president and replaced him with one committed to the sole task of keeping the right to keep and bear arms. Neil Knox, a publisher of pro-gun magazines, was one of the prime movers in the takeover. He said that the NRA, number 8, was trying to dump anti-gun control activities in exchange for financial support from several foundations, including the Ford Foundation. So once again, we see the hands of the tax-free foundations working against the best interests of the American people. Why were the foundations interested in the NRA? Perhaps Robert Kukla, executive director of the NRA's Institute for Legislative Action, answered this question when he wrote this, number 9. If the NRA were to move away from firearms ownership as the core issue, the grassroots power base would be sacked, and we would lose our right to keep and bear arms, and the conspiracy would be able to impose their dictatorship down on us. We would have no way to resist. The fact that we still have our weapons has got to rate as one of the great victories over this conspiracy. But the biggest victory of all over this conspiracy occurred in 1976, when they were unable to impose their dictatorship on the American people. To understand how they had hoped to accomplish this task, I've got to go back to 1912 and review a book published that year. And this is that book. We've talked about it before in this series. It's simply called Philip Drew Administrator, and it set the pattern for the plan set up for the dictatorship plan for 1976. It was written by Colonel Edward Mandell House, who was behind the elections of Woodrow Wilson and Franklin Roosevelt. Colonel House has his hero, Philip Drew, take over the White House and the presidency by marching 500,000 troops into Washington. In his book, there is an actual battle between these troops and the government troops. But in the end, Drew's troops are victorious, and he becomes America's dictator. And on page 45 of his book, House discusses the type of government that Drew gave America. He says that government would be this: socialism as dreamed of by Karl Marx. I believe that Colonel House was laying down the game plan for future attempts to impose a dictatorship on America. All you need is an army of 500,000 to march on Washington in order to create an impression that there is a crisis severe enough to convince the American people that the only solution is to accept a dictatorship. In other words, if you can get 500,000 people to march on Washington and then have the president declare that the crisis is a national emergency, the American people will accept the solution to that crisis. I want you to remember that number of 500,000. We'll see it again. The first time that I can find in my research that this conspiracy attempted to put this plan into effect was 1932. 3 bankers approached Major General Smedley Butler with an offer to provide millions of dollars to the general so that he could raise an army of, guess what, 500,000 to march on Washington. General Butler was an American patriot, and he exposed their plans. If he had been successful, the plan would have made Franklin Roosevelt the first American dictator. But the conspiracy chose the wrong man in General Butler, and America remained free. Another great American patriot. The next attempt came in 1968, when this conspiracy planned on having, once again, an army of 500,000 march on Chicago during the Democratic Convention. Jerry Rubin, a self-proclaimed revolutionary, helped to plan the Chicago demonstration, and he wrote this book entitled simply Do It. There's Jerry Rubin's little book. There he is on the cover, and with an introduction by Eldridge Cleaver. In his book, Rubin talks about his plans for the convention. He wrote this, number 10. We once dreamed 500,000. Notice the figure. These are Jerry Rubin's own words. 500,000 people would come to Chicago. He also told us who was paying him to create the disturbance. On page 235 of Do It, he wrote this, number 11. Revolution is profitable, so the capitalists try to sell it. The hip capitalists have some allies within the revolutionary community. Long hairs who work as intermediaries between the kids on the street and the millionaire businessman. I believe that Chicago was to be a test to see if they could draw such a large crowd at one time, and they failed, fortunately for us. Mr. Rubin tells us, number 12, maybe 2,000 to 3,000 freaks, that's his word, made it. This was the first clue that they could not get the numbers they would need to do the job in Washington in 1976. But as far as I can tell, they went ahead with their plans anyway. They had to revise their requirements, however. They apparently decided to reduce the number they needed from 500,000 to 150,000. There were several groups formed that were to bring about a bloody nationwide revolution in America in 1976. One was an organization known as the Students for a Democratic Society. This group did not want a democratic society. They wanted a communist society. This is an article that was published in the Portland Oregonian in 1969. The headline reads, Students Rate Revolution as Primary Task. The article quoted Michael Klonsky, the executive secretary of the SDS, as saying this, number 13. Our primary task is to build a Marxist-Leninist revolutionary movement. The article then reported, number 14, Klonsky's belief in revolutionary communism is typical of the political beliefs of most of the leaders and many members in the SDS today. This communist group also had some strange allies, the wealthy capitalists. This book is entitled, I don't have it with me tonight, entitled The Strawberry Statement, and was written by a student at Columbia University by the name of James Simon Cunin. This is Mr. Cunin's ID card at Columbia University, and it was published in his book. Mr. Cunin reported on pages 115 and 116 that he went to a strategy meeting of the SDS at Columbia. There he heard a fellow member give a report on the SDS convention. This is what Mr. Cunin wrote, number 15. At the convention of the SDS, men from Business International roundtables, the meeting sponsored by Business International for the client groups and heads of government, tried to buy up a few radicals. These men are the world's leading industrialists, and they convene to decide how our lives are going to go. They're the left wing of the ruling class. They offered to finance our demonstrations in Chicago. We were also offered ESSO money, meaning Rockefeller money. They want us to make a lot of radical commotion so they can look more in the center as they move to the left. Mr. Cunin's discovery that some of the very wealthy wanted a revolution in America was confirmed by at least two more members of the SDS. This is Jerry Kirk, who was a member of not only the SDS, but also of the Black Panthers and of the Communist Party while he was a student at the University of Chicago. He tried to warn others all over the United States that the students were being used. He is quoted as saying, number 16, young people have no idea that they are playing into the hands of the establishment they claim to hate. The radicals think they're fighting the forces of the super-rich like Rockefeller and Ford, and don't realize that it is precisely such forces which are behind their own revolution, financing it and using it for their own purposes. In October of 1970, Charles Siragusa, the chief investigator for the Illinois Crime Commission, warned America when he reported, number 17, the SDS is planning anarchy which will surpass all levels of revolutionary activity seen in recent decades. The SDS represents both an immediate and a long-range threat to the internal security of this country. Well-calculated guerrilla warfare has become an integral part of their strategy. The SDS leaders are in constant communication with communist regimes in Cuba, North Vietnam, and the Viet Cong in South Vietnam. Another member of the SDS was David Gamer, who also saw the same activities inside that organization. He broke from the SDS and went on a national speaking tour warning the American people about the revolution being planned for the year 1976. Where did the revolutionary SDS get its money? At least part of their income came from the United States government. In 1970, the Ohio legislature held a briefing session on the SDS, and the head of the Ohio Highway Patrol testified that the SDS received $192,000 in federal money. That means our taxpayers' money, and $85,000 in Carnegie Foundation funds. Furthermore, the Ohio legislators learned that the federal government's Office of Economic Opportunity gave $193,313 to an offshoot of the Institute for Policy Studies in Washington to provide bail for rioters. In addition, they learned that a large number of SDS chapters in Illinois were supported by grants from the colleges. So we taxpayers were being asked to fund the revolution. Notice that the SDS was not raising the money by asking the American people to voluntarily contribute their money to further the cause of the revolution. The American people would never, never, never fund their own destruction. They'd never voluntarily pay for a bloody revolution. This conspiracy knows this. So they stole the money from us through our taxes and then funded the revolution. Someone else once commented in the past, number 18, the people never give up their liberties except under a delusion. In this case, the people never knew they were financing their own destruction in a bloody revolution. They were being deluded by the American government. Another group apparently created to cause trouble in 1976 was an organization called the American Indian Movement, called AIM, founded in 1968. This is Douglas Durham, the Director of Public Relations for AIM. He told the American people, number 19, AIM is a leader and may even be the director. Let me repeat that. AIM is a leader and may even be the director of the scheme to disrupt our nation's bicentennial in 1976. What Mr. Durham said was confirmed by William Kunstler, the AIM attorney. He was quoted as saying in March of 1974, number 20, I promise you revolution by 1976. It is better to die in the streets than go down without a whimper. Douglas Durham was an undercover agent for the FBI who had been ordered by them to infiltrate the AIM movement. So when he was asked to make a report, he identified the organizations, plural, he was to contact or which contacted him. He told us in June of 1975, number 21, after being instructed to establish a coalition of groups to create chaos during 1976, I was contacted by the Black Liberation Army, the Los Tres Committee of California, a Chicano organization, the Brown Berets, supported by the Socialist Workers Movement, the Irish Republican Army, the People's Republic of China, and the German Liberation Youth Group. Doesn't sound like a Sunday get-together, does it? He reported that at a meeting in late 1974, it was mentioned that Cleveland, Ohio, and Farmington, New Mexico would be the candidates for the kickoff of revolutionary tactics, including bombing and additional sniping. Later, a meeting was held in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, And number 22, it discussed the possibility of Des Moines, Iowa being one of the 25 major cities in the United States for chaotic actions. This is an article that appeared in the Oregon Journal on August the 23rd, 1974. The headline reads, "AIM leaders tied to red parleys." It said that Louis Moves Trees, a former member of AIM organization, testified, number 23, that AIM leaders Russell Means and Dennis Banks had 2 meetings with representatives from Red China, Czechoslovakia, the Soviet Union, East Germany, and the Communist parties of West Germany and Italy. So Douglas Durham went on a national speaking tour of 60 cities and told the truth of his discoveries, and the American Indian movement quietly faded into oblivion. As I've said in the past, the one thing that any conspiracy cannot stand is the light of truth. In other words, it only takes one courageous American to stop the plans of this conspiracy. And one such courageous American, Douglas Durham, did just that. America owes a great deal to this man, Douglas Durham, a true American patriot. Yet only a handful of Americans know how this solitary American saved this nation from violence and destruction. Before I close the discussion on the American Indian movement, I'd like to say one more thing. The American Indian movement received at least $400,000 from the Federal Office of Economic Opportunity. We taxpayers gave those revolutionaries at least $400,000 of our tax dollars so that we could finance our own destruction. This is a copy of a check issued by the Treasurer of the United States payable to the American Indian movement, dated October the 2nd, 1974. But I'm certain that the check was issued in error. Our own government would never send money to a group out to destroy America, would they? But the main group called to bring the people, 150,000 people, to Washington on July the 4th, 1976, was the People's Bicentennial Commission, started in 1971 as the People's American Revolutionary Bicentennial Commission. The founder told us what his views were, number 24. A political movement based on the new patriotism would be socialist, humanist, and internationalist in substance and content. Leadership was passed to Jeremy Rifkin, who made his views known in November 1971 when he wrote this, number 25. A genuine understanding of the revolutionary ideals is what links Thomas Paine, Sam Adams, and Benjamin Rush. By the way, these are all American patriots in the early days of 1776. And the American people with Lenin, Mao, and Che. Lenin is, of course, Nikolai Lenin, the Bolshevik communist who killed up to 40 million people in the bloody revolution of 1917. Mao is, of course, Mao Tse-tung, the communist who killed up to 80 million people in the communist revolution of 1923 to 1949. And Che was, of course, Che Guevara, the Cuban communist who killed thousands in the Cuban Communist Revolution of the 1950s. The People's Bicentennial Commission published a nationwide 8-page tabloid, and here it is. On the outside cover, it says that they're inviting 150,000 new patriots, as they called these people, to come to Washington, D.C. to, quote, declare your independence from big business. The tabloid says, number 26, this July 4th will see more than fireworks and hoopla. The People's Bicentennial Commission is planning a birthday party America will never forget. A day to commit ourselves to the revolution, the second American Revolution for a democratic economy. It is about the need for a new grassroots movement in America for fundamental economic change. The inside of the flyer tells us who some of the speakers will be at the rally. Jane Fonda, described by them as an Academy Award-winning anti-Vietnam War activist and feminist. This picture is of Miss Fonda at the controls of an anti-aircraft gun in North Vietnam in 1972. Another speaker was Reverend Jesse Jackson, leader of People United to Save Humanity and a civil rights activist. This picture of Reverend Jackson is of him delivering petitions in front of a relief of Nikolai Lenin, the brutal communist revolutionary. And the third speaker I want to bring to your attention is Dr. Benjamin Spock, described as an anti-war activist. So where did this revolutionary organization get its money? From the voluntary contributions from the American people? Not likely. How about from the voluntary contributions of those who wanted to bring revolution to the American people? Of course not. The People's Bicentennial Commission received money from the United States government. The taxpayers sent them money, and we were never asked if we wanted our tax money to finance a revolution. They received money from, guess who? The federally funded National Endowment for the Humanities. So we taxpayers were funding the very revolution in 1976 that was to change the Americans' economy and lifestyle. It was not to be a popular, massively supported revolution where millions of American people were asking their people in government to change their lifestyle. It was to be supported by 150,000 revolutionaries in concert with conspirators inside the government who funded it with our tax money. Here's how I feel the revolution was to take place and how the conspirators would take over. Step number 1, number 27. The 150,000 people march on Washington. Step number 2, the violent revolutionaries start acts of violence and destruction all over Washington. Step number 3, the President of the United States sees all of this violence, the mob demanding economic change, the nationally known speakers demanding changes, and he declares a national emergency and suspends the Constitution of the United States. The President has had this power ever since President John Kennedy unconstitutionally took it in 1961. Each American president has had this power since that time, and the so-called conservative President Ronald Reagan never repealed those unconstitutional executive orders. When the President in 1976 suspends the Constitution, he knows that it will work because there was a trial run in Canada in 1970, and this time it worked. On October the 16th, 1970, Premier Pierre Elliott Trudeau of Canada issued a declaration of the War Measures Act, which made him a virtual dictator. Using as his excuse the kidnapping of 2 officials by the communist FLQ, Trudeau set a precedent for police-state methods. Trudeau suspended the Canadian Bill of Rights. He now had the power of censorship and could search without warrant and arrest without trial. Step number 4, the President says that the reason he is suspending the Constitution is so that he can deal with the violence in the streets. Now, there was a precedent for all this in the 1930s. After the stock market crash of 1929, Franklin Roosevelt was elected president